Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
What's unfolding now in Iran is a story that's been escalating dramatically over the past few weeks. What began in late December as simmering protests over a crumbling currency and soaring living costs in Tehran's Grand Bazaar has snowballed into something far more profound. These demonstrations have swept across all 31 provinces, driven not just by economic hardship, but a widespread demand for the very downfall of the Islamic Republic's ruling clerics. But the regime's response has been brutal. Security forces have launched one of the harshest crackdowns in recent memory, using lethal force, detaining thousands, and enforcing near total internet blackouts to cut off communication. Independent monitoring groups estimate the death toll could range from several hundred to over 2,000 protesters. On the international front, tensions are mounting. The U.S. has signaled it may take action, withdrawing personnel from regional bases and threatening punitive measures, while Iran warns any external strike will be met with retaliation. So that's the situation. A country in revolt, a regime digging in hard, and a flashpoint of international tension, all unfolding in real time. I'm Mark Day, and today on The Big Story, we're talking to Dr. Maral Karimi, who teaches at Toronto Metropolitan University and the University of Toronto. She holds a PhD in critical theory and focuses on social movements in the global south, especially Iran. Well, thank you for joining us today to talk about, what is happening in Iran and, just looking at, the last, couple of days. There's, so much news that is coming out and living in a world where with social media, you don't know what to believe. There's a lot of disinformation, misinformation, and that can be dangerous for those who are still in the country right now protesting and for people outside of the country. We'll get into, that conversation as well of just where maybe people can find their news and find that information that is relevant. But let's start with when you look at the country today, when you look at Iran, what's the one thing, you wish people outside of the country maybe understood about that?
Well, hi, Mark. I'd like to also say hello to your listeners. The one thing that I would like people, not just lay people, but journalists, political pundits, everyone to understand this is that Iran, just like any other nation, is not a monolith. There's a multiplicity of voices. It's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country. It's very vast. There are 90 million people. Surely they're not a singular voice, but oftentimes in the media, they're portrayed as just a singular ideology. What Iranians want. Well, 90 million people, all of them don't want the same thing. Sometimes they want things that might be standing in contrast with each other. Sometimes they converge. And so it's important to understand any nation, especially one in upheaval, as a plurality, not a monolith.
Before we get to the present moment, can you just kind of maybe give us that crash course, the history of the country and when it went from, a monarchy to the Islamic Republic that we know today?
Sure. If you don't mind, I actually like to go back a little bit and start at the beginning of the 20th century, which marks the basically the onset of modern Iran as we know it today. So it starts with a constitutional revolution, which essentially it's a vast, very progressive revolution during the dynasty prior to the Pahlavis, the last monarchy called the Qajars. There is the first constitution drafted, and there are certain laws and rights of the citizens are put on paper, and essentially the country forms a more modern structure. That's the first major revolution in modern times. And then later on, there is another revolution, which many of your listeners are probably familiar with, the 79 revolution, which replaced the monarchy, the last monarchy, the Pahlavis, with the current state. At the time, there were, again, plurality of voices. There were the leftists, the socialists, the Islamists, the liberal nationalists that essentially took to streets, and for a long time, that culminated in one final year. They protested and brought down the regime, and the Islamists, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in exile in Paris at the time, managed to establish the current state. Yet the Islamic Republic, if I can say one thing about it, has always seemed to me as an unfinished state, unstable state, in that it was never stable in its existence. And there have been multiple mass uprisings in its 47 years, and including the 2009 Green Movement, the Woman Life Freedom, for example, that your audiences might remember from 2022, and this current 2026 movement.
That kind of brings us to the repeated movements. I remember being in university in 1999 and being a student there and watching what was happening at the time. I think that was the student protests, and then the Green Movement, being a talk show host, the fuel protests in 2019, and and as you said, the Women Life Freedom protests. What patterns do you see across these waves over the years with these protests?
So, Mark, I actually, this is my research. This is my bread and butter. So the reason I took your audiences back to the beginning of the 20th century is to demonstrate a pattern of grievances that have culminated over a century and a quarter of a century, like 125 years, of grievances that are not met by multiple regimes, multiple monarchies, states, etc., which is the reason. So we have to stop and ask ourselves, if a peoples continue to take to the streets and protest generation after generation, manage to remove leaders, change policies, bring down monarchies, yet they're still in a dire situation. What does that tell us? That tells us that regimes and leaders might come and go, but these grievances are not met. Which then brings us to the Islamic Republic, the more recent history. The 2009 Green Movement, I'll do a quick crash course. The 99, I was also a student at the time. The 99 student movements, that was probably the first major uprising post 79 revolution. And it was quickly cracked down on, and it was crushed. So that was largely, I would say this, in the history of Iran, modern Iran, street protests are largely the purview of the urban, educated middle classes. However, there are certain exceptions, very important exceptions to this. Same was 1999 that we just talked about, 2009. It was urban middle classes. It was rights-based. The one major slogan was, "Where is my vote?" And which is a purely political ask. It is at the same time as it's holding a regime, a government responsible. It's also legitimizing it in a way. And then somewhat similar to the Woman Life Freedom, again, largely urban, though with some minor exceptions, educated, young people, rights-based. And however, that was not really, that went much further and called for death to the dictator, similar to what's happening right now, and targeted the core of the regime and wanted the collapse of it. Um, in the middle there, the 2019-2018 protests, or as they might be known in the West as the Bread riots, were an exception, but an important exception that were also followed by multiple strikes in the steel industry, in the paper industry, in especially in the south of Iran. So they were largely formed by the working poor and the working classes, people in the lower socioeconomic strata of the regime, people who largely and historically form the core of the base of the regime. So that was quite significant that was those people were also taking to the street. They were calling for bread, jobs, freedom. Others were calling death to the dictator and down with the regime. So, which brings us to the current moment in history.
That's the sound of James adding long-lasting Gain scent boosters to his laundry this morning. Several hours later, James sniffs the irresistible scent of Gain on his shirt. Gain. Several hours later, James has even caught the attention of his mother-in-law, and she never gives him attention.
Ooh, you smell amazing, James.
Oh, thanks, Mom. I love you too.
I never said that.
Add Gain scent boosters to your laundry. Add joy to your day.
If you were explaining Iran in 2026, where we are today, to someone who maybe hasn't followed the news, doesn't know that history, what are the three biggest pressures or the biggest pressures on that country today?
So, domestically, oftentimes the analysis I hear, Mark, I'll be honest with you, it's one-sided. They either focus on the domestic issues or the international pressures. The fact is, for comprehensive analysis, to understand where the leaders of the Islamic Republic are and where the people are, we have to look at both. So, domestically, we're dealing with a rentier state. And what does that mean? It means a state that sells oil and raw material and spends that money to run the country. And because it's a theocracy, it's highly ideological, and at the same time it's a rentier state, that wealth that trickles into the country, that comes back in, is oftentimes only distributed amongst those who are ideologically aligned with the regime and who support it or simply don't pose as a threat. And it used to be the first maybe 20, 30 years, it would trickle down to the other classes and, it would trickle down to the other socioeconomic classes. But now we get to the external factors. So because of the sanctions, which come for a couple of reasons that I will get to in a point, and after the 12-day war, there are further pressures on Iran. So the sanctions that United States and some European countries have placed on Iran force the government's hand even more. This is a regime that has long been unwilling and at the same time incapable of meeting the demands of its people. Whether it's economic, political, it's in an environmental disaster, it cannot manage its own electricity and energy sector. And so prior to that, with the wealth that was coming in, it was a great help. It would manage to some extent. But with the sanctions that were put on Iran, that bit of help is gone. And so the sanctions are placed on Iran. I don't want to simply blame all of Iran's problems on the sanctions. The grievances that the people on the streets have are legitimate. Like I said, they've been going on for decades, if not a century. But the sanctions are placed on Iran for a couple of reasons, a couple of major reasons. One, obviously, the United States and Iran are at odds. The United States, the grand hegemon in the region, wants a compliant regime in Iran and would not put up with the fact that Iran wants to do its own thing and go its own way. And at the same time, the Iranian state for it to put it in Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the regime's words, to export the revolution and its ideology, and at the same time to assert its dominance and to find help and support within the region, has managed to spend an egregious amount of wealth and resources on its proxies. So, and these proxies cause a lot of trouble in the region, obviously, with Israel, in Yemen, in Iraq, etc., etc. So the sanctions are placed on Iran. They wreak havoc on the economy, and at the same time, the politics. I want your listeners to ask themselves: yes, the sanctions place an important pressure on the economy. But what about on the politics? Do the sanctions and the pressures of the West also push the Islamic State, for example, to force women to dress a certain way and control their bodies? Do the sanctions force the Islamic regime in Iran to ban women from participating, from watching sports in sports stadiums? These are some of the demands, though these are not, these are not the ceiling of the demands of the Iranian women and their allies in Iran. These are just simple demands that the regime could have met. But I'm trying to point out that they repeatedly refuse to budge an inch.
What role have women and Gen Z played in the recent protests, and how significant is that for the country's future?
So women are the first are the first victims of the Islamic Republic. One of the first main decree that Ayatollah Khomeini issued once he came back to Iran was that women have to cover up. They have to be donning Islamic attire, and he also canceled the family laws that had recently been developed in the previous regime that gave women some small rights in family courts in terms of divorce and custody and all those. So essentially, he claimed he declared a war on women and their bodies. And Iranian women have resisted, obviously, the past 47 years, and the culmination of which we saw in the Woman Life Freedom. Those young people that you saw on the street, those early 20-year-olds, they're standing on the shoulders of generations of women in Iran that have resisted since the beginning of the 20th century, that have educated them, that have instilled this culture of resistance, and organized despite all the repression, that have worked and educated, etc., etc. The Gen Z, however, and this is controversial, there are a couple issues that I have with that. I mean, there is a lot of talk about how the Gen Z in Iran, to be honest with you, I don't even know if we can call them Gen Z. It's a North American notion rooted in post-war generations. But the current generation in Iran, the young people, the generation but essentially that came after me, is, I don't believe they carry the emancipatory potential we claim or wish that they would have. And it is not because they're simply bad or lazy or entitled or all these other characteristics we like to attribute to Gen Z, whether it's here or elsewhere. It is because they have grown up under an extremely repressive regime that has hollowed out the culture, And at the same time, which was pretty much a somewhat a similar case as I was growing up. We were the first generation. We were called the children of the revolution. We're being the first generation that was being indoctrinated. Had to wear the complete Islamic attire to school, even when we were like, well, I was 5 when I started school, and even according to Islamic rule, girls shouldn't be wearing that at 5, not until 9 years old, but we had to. Um, so this generation, the difference is um, the culture has been hollowed out, coupled by the negative impacts of social media. I mean, they do see that there are positives to this, of course. They do see how everybody else around the world lives. They are not willing to put up with many of the repressive and patriarchal norms placed on them in the family and in the society. And we're their parents. So we've had something to do. My generation has had something to do with it. Many of us have put up with those norms in our family. We don't want that for our children. And so they're dealing with a complete set of norms. And at the same time, their situation is far more desperate than it was for us. Most of them cannot imagine any future for themselves.
The American government has always played such a crucial role in this, and we have a different leader in the White House today than past years with President Donald Trump. We've heard him speak over the last few days about help being on the way and watching very closely, and that the executions have stopped. That's one thing he said in a news conference yesterday. What role does the U.S. play right now in this situation?
So the Iranian regime is obviously vigilant and watching every word he says because they want to avoid an attack by the United States or Israel, obviously, at any cost. They might be forced into it, but they want to avoid it. I would say this, though. I see a lot of analysis talking about how Iranians want foreign intervention, and I'm not dismissing that there are some. That the situation is so dire, the violence is so bad, the economic situation is so bad that some people don't see a way out, and we can't blame them. We have to be understanding of that. But at the same time, foreign intervention doesn't often bring in usher in democracy, if history has anything to tell us. And let's not forget the roots of animosity between the United States and Iran, which is in the 1953 coup, instilling the current crown prince's father back in removing a more democratically oriented, more nationalistic figure that people really wanted. It was through the Anglo-American coup of 1953, and later on, that coup is one of the root causes of the '79 revolution. So I think it would be a mistake to assume that the posturing of the regime that they're ready for anything. I really don't think they're ready for an attack, but at the same time, they're counting on the fact, and I have to unfortunately agree with that many people will rally around the flag should there be an attack on Iran, or should there be any attempt by a foreign nation to annex parts of Iran.
So we'll watch over, the course of the next few days, weeks, months, years ahead of where we're going. One final question to you. We've seen these movements in the past. We've seen the Iranian government crack down on these protesters. What do you foresee and hope for with this latest movement and uprising within that country?
First and foremost, I hope in vain that once the digital blackout is over and we have better information, that, again, in vain, I'm hoping that the extent of violence is not as bad as we think it is. That's just wishful thinking on my part. I'm looking for what role the IRGC is going to play, how its role is going to morph, and how the Canadian government is going to react to all of this. If your audience is probably remember, the IRGC is the group responsible for shooting down the Ukrainian flight in 2020, which killed hundreds of Canadians. And look at how Israel and the United States, you look at their rhetoric in the Arab states, the Gulf states in the region, how they're reacting to this. But more importantly, how the regime is going to try and adapt if it can to because business as usual is not going to be possible after this brutality.
Thank you so much for joining us on The Big Story, for your insight today, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And that was The Big Story. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this conversation. Send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. Reach us on Instagram @frequencypods or on Blue Sky @thebigstory. If you know someone that might enjoy this episode, be sure to send it to them. You can listen to The Big Story every day on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts. Maria Costain is our lead producer. Diana Kay is the head of strategy and content. Desi Nair is the manager of podcast operations. I'm Mark Day. Thanks for listening.